Every father knows the heartbreak of watching his child's dreams slip away because he can't provide what other kids have. For Daniel Quinn, that pain cut deeper than losing his job or his marriage ever could. This single dad was down to his last $100 when he decided to take his 8-year-old son Leo on one final adventure. They packed their old hiking gear and headed to the Montana mountains, following a trail Daniel's father had told him about years ago. Deep in a forgotten valley, they found an abandoned train hidden by trees and time. Inside one of the cars, beneath loose floorboards, they discovered something that would change everything. A secret vault filled with old paintings, bonds, and artifacts worth $12 million. But keeping this treasure would prove harder than finding it. What would you risk to give your child the future they deserve? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the thin walls of the cramped apartment at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Daniel Quinn had set it to ring. He'd been awake for hours anyway, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a question mark. How fitting, considering his life had become one big question mark with no clear answers in sight. Daniel rolled out of the narrow single bed, careful not to wake Leo, who slept peacefully on the pull-out couch across their studio apartment. The boy's face, relaxed in sleep, still held traces of yesterday's disappointment when Daniel had to explain why they couldn't afford the $20 field trip to the Science Museum. Leo had simply nodded, the way he always did now when another small dream got crushed by their reality. The morning routine had become a careful choreography of quiet movements. Daniel stepped over the broken bicycle that Leo had been asking him to fix for 3 months. Another promise he couldn't keep without money for parts. He made his way to their tiny kitchenette, where a single coffee cup sat beside an empty jar that once held peanut butter. The refrigerator hummed loudly, struggling to keep their meager groceries cold. A half-gallon of milk with 2 days left before expiration, some generic cheese slices, and leftover spaghetti from 2 nights ago. 6 months. That's how long it had been since Meridian Environmental Solutions had terminated him for cause. Their euphemism for refusing to falsify environmental impact reports that would have cleared a chemical plant's expansion into a protected watershed. The wrongful termination lawsuit was still tied up in court, bleeding what little savings he'd had into his lawyer's pocket. His former colleagues wouldn't return his calls, afraid of being associated with a whistleblower in an industry where reputation meant everything. Daniel opened his wallet and counted the bills again, as if they might have multiplied overnight. $97. After rent was due on Friday, he'd have exactly nothing. The eviction notice was already taped to their door, giving them 10 days to find miracle money or a new place to live. In Billings, Montana, miracles felt as scarce as affordable housing for a single father with bad credit. Leo stirred on the couch, one small hand reaching out in sleep toward where Daniel's bed used to be before the divorce lawyer fees forced him to sell it. The boy had never complained about giving up his own bedroom when they'd had to move from their house into this place. Never complained when Daniel had to sell his car and they'd started taking the bus everywhere. Never complained when birthday, parties and school events became luxuries they couldn't afford. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling their small space with the rich aroma that reminded Daniel of Saturday mornings in the house they used to call home. Back when he'd wake up to Leo's laughter echoing from the kitchen as his ex-wife Sarah made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Before she'd decided that loving someone meant they should be able to provide better than food stamps and thrift store clothes. "You're a good man, Daniel," she'd said during their last conversation, her voice carrying that particular tone of pity that cut deeper than anger. "But Leo needs stability. He needs a father who can actually take care of him." The divorce papers had been signed on a Tuesday. She'd remarried on a Saturday. Her new husband drove a BMW and owned 3 dental practices across the state. Leo called him Uncle Mike and spent every other weekend in their suburban house with a pool and a golden retriever named Buddy. Daniel pulled out his father's old hiking pack from the narrow closet, its canvas exterior weathered from decades of Montana mountain trails. Inside the front pocket, his fingers found what he'd been looking for. A faded photograph of his father at 35, grinning beneath a wide-brimmed hat, mountains stretching endlessly behind him. On the back, in his father's careful handwriting, "The ribbon between the worlds, 1987. Some trails lead to more than just views, son." His father had told him stories about that trail during long winter evenings, speaking of hidden valleys and forgotten places where the old railroad used to run supplies to mining camps in the 1800s. Places where a man could think clearly, away from the noise of ordinary life. Places where boys became men and men remembered who they really were. "Dad?" Leo's sleepy voice drifted across the apartment. "Morning, buddy. Sleep okay?" Leo sat up, rubbing his eyes with small fists. At 8 years old, he carried himself with a seriousness that made Daniel's heart ache. Children shouldn't have to worry about rent money or wonder why other kids had things they couldn't have. "Are we going to have to move again?" Leo asked, his voice matter-of-fact in the way children learned to be when disappointment became routine. Daniel sat on the edge of the pull-out couch, the metal frame creaking under his weight. "What would you say if I told you I had an idea for an adventure instead?" Leo's eyes brightened for the first time in weeks. "What kind of adventure?" "The kind your grandfather used to tell me about. Mountains and fresh air and trails that lead to places most people never see." Daniel held up the photograph. "Your grandfather left me some maps and stories about a special trail, something he called the ribbon between the worlds." Leo took the photo with careful hands, studying his grandfather's face with the intensity children brought to treasures. "He looks happy." He was happiest when he was out there, exploring places that made him feel alive. Daniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was thinking maybe it's time we figured out what he was talking about. Just you and me, buddy, father and son adventure. But what about school? School will be there when we get back. This is different. This is about us learning something we can't get from books." Leo was quiet for a long moment, processing. "Would we sleep in tents? We would cook our food over a campfire, follow trails that your grandfather walked when he was young, and it would just be us. Just us." Something shifted in Leo's expression. A spark of excitement mixing with the cautious hope he'd learned to keep protected. "When would we go?" Daniel looked around their small apartment, at the eviction notice on the door, at the broken bicycle, and the empty refrigerator, at his son's face, so eager for something good to happen in their string of difficult days. How about today? Within 2 hours, they'd packed everything they owned that mattered into Daniel's father's old camping gear. Sleeping bags that smelled like cedar and adventure, a camp stove that had cooked countless meals under Montana skies, water bottles and a first aid kit, and granola bars that would have to serve as their grocery budget for the week. Leo helped fold their few clothes into the backpack with the careful attention he brought to everything now, as if he understood that taking care of what they had was the only way to make sure they didn't lose it. He tucked his favorite book, a battered copy of Hatchet that Daniel had found at a used bookstore, into the front pocket alongside his grandfather's photograph. The drive to the trailhead took them west, through rolling hills that gradually gave way to the dramatic peaks of the Absaroka Range. Daniel had traded their grocery money for gas, but watching Leo's face pressed against the passenger window, pointing out eagles and elk, and the way morning light painted the mountainsides, he knew he'd made the right choice. "Dad, look!" Leo pointed toward a cluster of aspens whose leaves had turned brilliant gold in the early autumn air. "They look like they're on fire, but good fire." "Good fire," Daniel agreed, feeling something in his chest loosen for the first time in months. The trailhead parking area was nearly empty on a Wednesday morning. Just a few serious hikers loading packs onto their backs before disappearing into the forest. Daniel checked his father's hand-drawn map one more time, comparing it to the official trail markers. According to the notes, they'd need to hike the main trail for about 3 miles before looking for an unmarked path that branched north toward what his father had labeled simply as the valley. "You ready for this, Leo?" Leo shouldered his small pack, loaded with snacks and his book, and a sense of adventure that made him seem older than his 8 years. "I'm ready, Dad." They set off together into the mountains, father and son walking side by side on a trail that promised to lead somewhere neither of them had ever been. Behind them, their small apartment and its eviction notice and broken bicycle grew smaller until they disappeared entirely. Ahead, the forest opened its arms to welcome 2 travelers who had nothing left to lose and everything to discover. The morning air tasted like pine needles and possibility. For the first time in months, Daniel Quinn felt like maybe, just maybe, they were walking towards something better instead of running away from something worse. He had no way of knowing that before the sun set again, their lives would change in ways that would make every hardship they'd endured seem like preparation for the adventure that was about to begin. The trail wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir, their boots crunching softly on the carpet of fallen needles that muffled their footsteps. Leo walked ahead with the boundless energy of childhood, stopping every few minutes to examine interesting rocks or point out birds that flitted through the canopy above. Daniel followed at a steady pace, consulting his father's hand-drawn map and comparing it to the landmarks they passed. 3 miles in, just as his father's notes had indicated, they found what looked like an old game trail branching north from the main path. It was barely visible, overgrown with mountain ash and serviceberry bushes, marked only by a few weathered blazes carved into tree trunks decades ago. "This way, Leo," Daniel called, pulling aside a curtain of branches. The unmarked trail climbed steadily through terrain that grew wilder with each step. Ancient trees pressed close on both sides, their massive trunks creating a living cathedral that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the forest floor. The air grew cooler and thinner as they gained elevation, carrying scents of wildflowers and something else, something that reminded Daniel of old metal and forgotten places. Leo had grown quieter as they climbed, saving his breath for the steady ascent, but his eyes remained bright with curiosity. When they crested a ridge after an hour of hiking, he was the first to spot what lay in the valley below. "Dad, look at that!" Daniel followed his son's pointing finger and felt his breath catch. Spread out before them was a hidden valley, completely enclosed by steep mountain walls and accessible only through the narrow gap where they now stood. But what made him stare in wonder wasn't the valley's natural beauty. It was the dark line that cut straight across its floor like a scar through the wilderness. Railway tracks. Rusted and overgrown, but unmistakably the remains of a railroad line that shouldn't exist in this remote location. "Is that a train track?" Leo asked, his voice filled with excitement. Daniel pulled out his father's compass from the old hiking pack, watching as the needle swung wildly before settling on a direction that pointed directly toward the valley floor. The compass itself was a mystery. His father had never mentioned owning one, and Daniel couldn't remember seeing it before today. Yet there it was, nestled in a side pocket as if it had always belonged there. "Let's go find out," Daniel said. The descent into the valley took them through terrain that felt untouched by human presence for decades. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, Indian paintbrush and lupine and bare grass creating a natural garden that stretched toward the abandoned railway line. The air shimmered with the kind of pristine clarity that only existed in places far from civilization. As they drew closer to the tracks, Daniel could see that the railway was more substantial than he'd first thought. These weren't the narrow-gauge tracks used by mining operations, but full-sized railroad rails that could have carried passenger trains. The wooden ties were weathered but solid, and the steel rails, though rusted, showed the kind of heavy construction that suggested serious investment in whatever operation had once run through this valley. "Where do you think it goes?" Leo asked, running alongside the tracks with his arms outstretched like an airplane. "I don't know, buddy. Let's follow it and see." They walked the railway line for nearly a mile, the tracks leading them deeper into the valley toward a grove of massive cottonwood trees that grew close to what appeared to be a natural spring. The sound of running water grew louder as they approached, and Daniel was beginning to think they'd find nothing more than the remnants of an old logging operation, when Leo suddenly stopped and pointed ahead. "Dad, there's something in those trees." At first, Daniel saw only shadows and the interplay of light and leaves, but as they drew closer, shapes began to emerge from the camouflage of time and vegetation. Train cars, 3 of them, sitting on a section of track that curved into the grove, like the railway had been designed to end in this exact spot. The cars were old, turn-of-the-century passenger coaches with ornate metalwork and high windows, their once elegant paint now faded to the color of autumn leaves. Ivy and wild grapevines had grown over much of their exterior, creating a natural cocoon that had somehow preserved them from the worst effects of weather and time. "Are there people inside?" Leo whispered, moving closer to Daniel. "I don't think so, son. These have been here for a very long time." They approached the first car cautiously. Its windows were intact, but so covered with decades of grime and organic growth that it was impossible to see inside. Daniel tried the door and found it locked, but the second car yielded to pressure when he put his shoulder against its entrance. The door opened with a groan of protest, revealing an interior that took Daniel's breath away. The passenger compartment was like stepping into a time capsule from the early 1900s. Plush velvet seats, though faded and dusty, still held their elegant curves. Brass fixtures gleamed dimly in the filtered light, and an ornate chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals somehow still intact after all these years. "Wow," Leo breathed, stepping inside with the reverence children showed in museums. Daniel followed, noting details that spoke to the car's original luxury. Hand-carved wooden panels lined the walls, inlaid with what looked like mother-of-pearl designs. The floor was covered in a Persian carpet that had somehow survived the decades, its intricate patterns still visible beneath layers of dust. "Dad, look at this," Leo called from the far end of the car. He was standing beside what appeared to be a private compartment, its door standing slightly ajar. Inside, Daniel could see a small sleeping berth and a mahogany writing desk, its surface still set with crystal inkwells and a brass letter opener. "This must have been for someone really important," Daniel said, running his fingers over the fine craftsmanship. It was Leo who noticed that one section of the ornate floorboards didn't quite match the others. Children, Daniel reflected, had a way of seeing things that adults missed. The boy knelt down and traced the outline of what looked like a hidden panel. "Dad, I think this opens." Daniel examined the section more closely and realized Leo was right. The floorboards here formed a rectangle that sat slightly proud of the surrounding wood, and when he pressed on one corner, the entire section tilted, up on hidden hinges. Below was a cavity lined with oiled canvas and metal, a hidden vault built into the very structure of the train car. And inside that vault, protected from time and weather by careful engineering and sheer luck, lay treasures that made Daniel's heart race with disbelief. Paintings in gilded frames, their surfaces protected by glass and careful wrapping. Boxes that appeared to contain jewelry and precious metals. Stacks of documents bound in ribbon and scattered throughout. Artifacts that spoke of wealth and culture from a bygone era. Carved jade figurines, silver tea services, books bound in leather that looked like they belonged in the private library of a mansion. "Dad, are we rich now?" Leo asked, his 8-year-old mind cutting straight to the heart of what this discovery might mean. Daniel stared at the vault's contents, his engineer's mind trying to calculate values, while his father's heart wondered what this would mean for their future. For Leo's future. "I don't know, son," he said honestly, "but I think we just found something that's going to change our lives." Outside the train car, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, painting the hidden valley in shades of gold and ember. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, its voice echoing off the mountain walls that surrounded their secret world. Daniel Quinn, who had awakened that morning with $97 and an eviction notice, now knelt beside a treasure that could solve every problem they'd ever had. But as he would soon learn, some discoveries bring as many complications as they do solutions. And in this hidden valley, where time seemed to move differently and compasses pointed toward destiny rather than magnetic north, their real adventure was only just beginning. They spent the night in their tent beside the hidden spring, close enough to the train cars to keep watch, but far enough away that Leo could sleep without staring at the treasure that had turned their world upside down. Daniel lay awake most of the night, listening to the sound of running water and his son's peaceful breathing, while his mind raced through possibilities and problems that seemed to multiply in the darkness. By morning, he'd made a decision. They would return to town, act normal, and research what they'd found before making any moves that might attract the wrong kind of attention. The last thing he wanted was to lose Leo's trust by making promises he couldn't keep, or worse, to put them both in danger by being careless with information. The hike back to the trailhead felt different now. Leo chattered excitedly about their discovery, asking questions that Daniel couldn't answer, and making plans that might never come to pass. How much was it worth? Could they buy a house with a big yard? Could they get a dog? When Daniel gently suggested they keep their adventure secret until they knew more, Leo nodded with the seriousness of a child inducted into an important adult conspiracy. Back in their small apartment, everything looked exactly as they'd left it, the eviction notice still taped to the door, the broken bicycle still occupying precious floor space, the empty refrigerator still humming its struggling song. But Daniel felt like he was seeing their life through new eyes, as if the possibility of change had shifted his perspective on what had seemed like permanent problems. The first stop was the Billings Public Library, where the local history section occupied two dusty shelves in the back corner of the building. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly librarian who'd worked there longer than anyone could remember, looked up from her cataloguing with the pleased expression she reserved for patrons who showed interest in anything older than last week's bestsellers. "Mr. Quinn, isn't it? Leo's father. How can I help you today?" "We're doing some research on old railroad lines in the area," Daniel said carefully, "particularly any that might have run through the mountain valleys west of here." Mrs. Henderson's eyes brightened. "Oh, that's a fascinating topic. Most people don't realize how extensive the railway system was in Montana during the mining boom. Come with me." She led them to a corner table and disappeared into the stacks, returning with an armload of books and folders that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. Local histories, railway surveys, mining company records, and newspaper clippings dating back to the 1800s. The Montana Central Railway had several branch lines that served the mining camps, she explained, spreading out a hand-drawn map that showed dotted lines extending into areas Daniel recognized. Most of them were abandoned when the mines played out, but there were rumors of private lines as well. Some of the wealthy mining families built their own railways to transport not just ore, but their personal effects to summer retreats in the mountains. Leo sat quietly beside Daniel, pretending to read a picture book while actually listening to every word. Daniel found himself studying a particular section of the map where several lines converged in an area labeled simply as Ashworth Holdings. "Tell me about the Ashworths," Daniel said. Mrs. Henderson settled into her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting years for someone to ask that question. The Ashworths were one of the most powerful families in Montana during the early 1900s. Old Thomas Ashworth made his fortune in copper mining, but his daughter Victoria was the interesting one. Beautiful, educated, rebellious by the standards. Over time, She was supposed to marry into another mining family, but there were always rumors that she had other plans. What kind of plans? Well, this is where history gets mixed up with legend, you understand. But the stories say Victoria was in love with someone her father wouldn't approve of, a railway engineer, if I remember correctly. There was talk that she'd converted part of her inheritance to portable wealth, jewelry, art, things that could travel easily. The plan was supposedly to elope and start a new life somewhere far from Montana. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. What happened? That's the mystery. Victoria Ashworth disappeared in 1903. Some say she ran away with her lover. Others believed her family had her committed to an asylum to prevent the scandal. But her body was never found, and neither was any trace of the treasure she was supposed to have taken. Mrs. Henderson pulled out a leather-bound journal from one of the folders. This belonged to her personal maid, donated to the library by a descendant. It contains some interesting entries about Victoria's final weeks. Daniel opened the journal carefully, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting was careful and precise, documenting the daily life of a wealthy household in meticulous detail. But as he read the entries from late 1903, a different story began to emerge. Miss Victoria has been acting most peculiar of late, one entry read. She spends hours writing letters that she burns immediately and has had me pack and repack her traveling trunk 3 times. She keeps asking about the railway schedules, particularly the private line that serves the family's mountain retreat. Yesterday I found her crying over her mother's jewelry box, selecting pieces as if she might never see the rest again. Another entry, dated just days before Victoria's disappearance, was even more revealing. Miss Victoria asked me to witness her signature on a document today, though she wouldn't let me read what it contained. She sealed it in an envelope and told me it was insurance for the future. She seemed frightened, though she tried to hide it. I fear something terrible is going to happen. Daniel closed the journal, his mind racing. If Victoria Ashworth had indeed taken a fortune and planned to escape by railway, and if that railway had led to the hidden valley where he and Leo had found the train cars, then what they discovered might be more than just abandoned treasure. It might be evidence of a century-old mystery. Mrs. Henderson, are there any living descendants of the Ashworth family? Oh yes, quite a few. They're still one of the prominent families in the state, though they've moved more into banking and real estate these days. Victoria's great-nephew runs the Ashworth Foundation here in Billings. Why do you ask? Daniel chose his words carefully. Leo and I have been doing some hiking in areas where the old railways used to run. We're curious about the history. Mrs. Henderson smiled. Well, if you're really interested, you might want to speak with Sarah Chen. She's a historian who specializes in Montana railway history. She's been researching the Ashworth family for years, trying to piece together what really happened to Victoria. She comes in here regularly to go through these materials. As they left the library, Leo carrying a children's book about trains that Mrs. Henderson had let him borrow, Daniel felt the weight of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just about money. It was about solving a mystery that had puzzled people for over a century. But it was also about something more immediate, keeping Leo safe while figuring out how to handle a discovery that could attract attention from people who might not have their best interests at heart. Dad, Leo said as they walked to the bus stop, are we going to tell people what we found? Daniel looked down at his son's trusting face and realized that whatever happened next, he had to make sure Leo understood that some secrets were worth protecting, at least until they knew who they could trust. Not yet, buddy. First we need to learn more about the story. Then we'll decide who needs to know. Leo nodded solemnly, clutching his library book. Neither of them noticed the dark sedan that had been parked across from the library, or the man inside who'd been watching them. Through the windows, their secret was already starting to slip. Daniel's old friend Marcus Rivera had always been the kind of lawyer who answered his phone no matter what time someone called, especially when that someone was in trouble. When Daniel reached him that evening from the payphone outside their apartment building, his cell service had been cut off 2 weeks ago. Marcus listened without interruption as Daniel carefully explained their discovery without mentioning specific locations or the full extent of what they'd found. "You need to be very careful here, Daniel," Marcus said when the story was finished. "Treasure trove law in Montana is complicated, and if what you're describing has historical significance, there could be multiple parties with legitimate claims." "What do you mean?" "Well, there's the landowner where the items were found, which could be private property or state land. There are potential heirs to the original owner. There's the possibility that some of these items were stolen property to begin with. And if they have archaeological or historical value, the state might have an interest in preserving them." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "So we might not be able to keep anything." "It depends on a lot of factors. The best thing you can do right now is document everything thoroughly and research the legal ownership as much as possible before anyone else gets involved. Once word gets out, you'll have treasure hunters, lawyers, and possibly law enforcement all wanting their piece of the action." "How long do we have?" "That depends on how well you can keep a secret. But Daniel, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain no one else knows about this?" Daniel thought about their visit to the library, Mrs. Henderson's helpful information, the suggestion to contact the historian Sarah Chen. "We've been careful." "Good. Keep it that way until we can figure out the best approach." After hanging up, Daniel walked back to their apartment to find Leo sitting at their small table, carefully drawing pictures of their adventure in the margins of his school notebook. The drawings were surprisingly detailed for an 8-year-old. The hidden valley, the train cars, even rough sketches of some of the treasures they'd seen. "Leo, buddy, remember what we talked about keeping this secret?" "I know, Dad. I'm not going to tell anyone." Leo held up his notebook. "But I wanted to remember it exactly right." Daniel sat down beside his son, studying the innocent drawings that captured their discovery with childlike precision. "These are really good, Leo, but maybe we should keep them private for now, okay?" "Okay." Leo closed the notebook and looked at his father with serious eyes. "Dad, are we going to be in trouble for finding it?" The question cut straight to Daniel's heart. Leo had already experienced too much uncertainty in his young life, and here Daniel was adding more by involving him in something that could go wrong in ways neither of them could predict. "I don't think so, son. But sometimes when people find valuable things, it gets complicated because other people might think they deserve them too. We just need to be smart about how we handle it. Like in my book," Leo said, referring to his copy of Hatchet. "Brian has to be careful about everything in the wilderness because one mistake could be really bad." Exactly like that. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Daniel was making breakfast when a knock at the door interrupted their quiet routine. Through the peephole, he saw a middle-aged Asian woman in professional clothing, holding a briefcase and looking like she belonged in a boardroom rather than the hallway of their run-down apartment building. "Mr. Quinn, my name is Sarah Chen. I believe Mrs. Henderson at the library mentioned that you might be interested in speaking with me about Montana railway history." Daniel's pulse quickened. This was the historian Mrs. Henderson had recommended, but he hadn't contacted her yet. How had she found them? He opened the door, but left the chain lock in place. "I'm sorry, how did you get my address?" Sarah Chen smiled apologetically. "I should have called first, but I don't have your phone number. Mrs. Henderson told me you'd been asking about the Ashworth family and the old railway lines. It's rare to find someone interested in that particular piece of history, so I thought we might be able to help each other." Leo appeared beside Daniel, curious about their visitor. Sarah's expression softened when she saw him. "You must be Leo. Mrs. Henderson mentioned you were helping your father with his research. Are you interested?" "In trains?" Leo nodded shyly. "We went hiking where there used to be train tracks." Daniel felt a warning bell go off in his head. But before he could interrupt, Sarah was already responding with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a kindred spirit. "That's wonderful. Most of the old lines are completely overgrown now, but if you know where to look, you can still find traces of them. Which area were you exploring?" "Leo," Daniel said quickly, "why don't you go finish your breakfast while Miss Chen and I talk?" But the damage was already done. Leo had shown just enough interest to confirm that they'd actually been to one of the old railway sites, not just reading about them in books. Sarah Chen's expression shifted slightly, becoming more focused. "Mr. Quinn, I've been researching the disappearance of Victoria Ashworth for over 5 years. I have reason to believe she didn't simply run away, as most people assume. I think something happened to her, and I think the evidence might still exist somewhere along those old railway lines." "What kind of evidence?" Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "May I come in? This might take a few minutes." "To explain." Against his better judgment, Daniel unhooked the chain and let her inside. Sarah glanced around their sparse apartment without comment, though he could see her taking in the eviction notice, the broken bicycle, the general atmosphere of people living paycheck to paycheck. She spread several documents on their small table: photographs, letters, and what appeared to be official railway documents from the early 1900s. "This is a photograph of Victoria Ashworth," Sarah said, pointing to a formal portrait of a beautiful young woman with intelligent eyes and an expression that suggested she was thinking about something far beyond the photographer's studio. "And this is a letter she wrote to a friend just weeks before she disappeared." Daniel read the letter, which spoke of Victoria's plans to find a place where the past couldn't follow, and her hope that someday people will understand the choices I had to make. "Now look at this," Sarah continued, producing a document that made Daniel's breath catch. It was a bill of lading for a private railway shipment, dated October 1903, listing the contents as personal effects and art collection belonging to Victoria Ashworth, destination listed as Mountain Station Private Line. "I believe Victoria didn't run away," Sarah said quietly. "I believe she was murdered by her own family to prevent her from exposing their illegal mining practices. And I believe she hid evidence of their crimes, along with her personal treasure, somewhere along that private railway line." She looked directly at Daniel. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you've been hiking in areas where the old lines used to run. I don't suppose you found anything interesting?" Daniel felt the weight of the gold locket in his pocket, the one item he'd taken from the train car as proof of their discovery. Inside the locket was a photograph of Victoria Ashworth and a young man who looked like he could have been the railway engineer Mrs. Henderson had mentioned. "Miss Chen," he said carefully, "what would happen if someone did find evidence related to Victoria's disappearance?" "It would be the most significant historical discovery in Montana in decades," she replied. "It would finally give Victoria justice, and probably expose crimes that were covered up for over a century." She paused, studying his face. "Mr. Quinn, if you found something, I can help you. But you need to understand that there are people who have spent a lot of money and effort making sure certain facts about the Ashworth family never come to light. If you've stumbled onto something important, you might need protection." Outside their apartment window, Daniel could see the dark sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, the same one he'd noticed yesterday outside the library. Their secret was definitely out, and the complications Marcus had warned about were already beginning. Daniel made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He pulled the gold locket from his pocket and placed it on the table in front of Sarah Chen. "We found this," he said simply. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the locket. When she saw the photograph inside, Victoria Ashworth with her arms around a young man in railway worker's clothes, her eyes filled with tears. "My God," she whispered. "This is James Morrison, the engineer who disappeared the same week Victoria did. I've been looking for proof of their relationship for years." She looked up at Daniel with new respect. "Where did you find this?" "In a place where Victoria might have hidden it, along with other things that belonged to her." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph with the intensity of someone who'd just seen a piece of history come to life. "Mr. Quinn, you need to understand what you've discovered. This isn't just about lost treasure. Victoria Ashworth was the key witness to her father's illegal dumping of mining waste into the Clark Fork River. Her testimony would have shut down his entire operation and probably sent him to prison. And you think her family killed her to prevent that? I think they tried to. But if you found her personal effects intact, it means she managed to hide them before whatever happened to her. That could include documents that prove the environmental crimes her father was committing. Leo, who'd been listening from the kitchen, appeared with his notebook. "Miss Chen, would you like to see my drawings?" Before Daniel could stop him, Leo had opened the notebook to his sketches of the hidden valley and the train cars. Sarah studied them with the eye of someone who understood what she was looking at. "These are very detailed, Leo. You have quite an artistic eye." She looked at Daniel. "How accurate are these drawings?" "Very," Daniel admitted. "Then you found the private railway terminus that Victoria used to reach her family's mountain retreat. According to the railway records I've uncovered, it was built specifically to transport the Ashworth family to a hunting lodge they maintained in a remote valley." She pointed to Leo's sketch of the train cars. "These look like they're in remarkably good condition for being abandoned for over a century." "The location protected them," Daniel said. "Hidden valley, natural shelter, dry climate." Sarah gathered her documents, but Daniel could see her mind working at high speed. "Mr. Quinn, I need to be direct with you. If what you've found is as significant as I think it is, you're going to need help navigating the legal and political implications. The Ashworth family still has considerable influence in this state." "What kind of influence?" "The kind that can make evidence disappear and inconvenient people face legal troubles. Victoria's great-nephew, Robert Ashworth, sits on the boards of 3 major banks and has political connections throughout Montana. If he believes you've found something that could damage his family's reputation, he'll use every resource at his disposal to discredit or intimidate you." As if summoned by their conversation, Daniel's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but when he answered, the voice was crisp and professional. "Mr. Quinn, this is Robert Ashworth. I understand you've been asking questions about my family's history. I'd like to invite you to lunch tomorrow to discuss your research." Daniel felt ice in his veins. "How did you get this number?" "Mr. Quinn, I make it my business to stay informed about people who take interest in family matters. Tomorrow at noon, the Petroleum Club. I think you'll find our conversation enlightening." The line went dead. Sarah was watching Daniel's face, and she didn't need to ask what the call had been about. "They know," she said simply. "How is that possible? We've only told you and my lawyer." Sarah's expression darkened. "Mrs. Henderson at the library mentioned that she'd given you information about the Ashworth family. The library's computer system logs all research requests, and the Ashworth Foundation has donated significantly to the library's digitization project. It wouldn't be difficult for them to monitor who's been accessing those records. So what do? You have several options, none of them perfect. You can meet with Robert Ashworth and try to negotiate some kind of arrangement. You can go to the media and make everything public before they can suppress it. Or you can contact federal authorities and report the discovery as potentially significant archaeological evidence." Daniel looked at Leo, who was listening with the wide-eyed expression children got when they realized the adult world was more complicated than they'd understood. "What would you recommend?" "Honestly, I'd recommend getting Leo somewhere safe first. If Robert Ashworth is desperate enough to make threats, he might not limit himself to legal pressure." "Threats? He invited me to lunch?" "Mr. Quinn, in my experience, when wealthy, powerful people invite struggling single fathers to lunch, it's rarely because they want to chat about family history. They want to make you an offer you can't refuse, or they want to make it clear what will happen if you don't cooperate." That evening, Daniel called his ex-wife for the first time in months. "Sarah, I need to ask you a favor." "Daniel, is everything okay? You sound worried. Leo and I found ourselves in a complicated situation. I can't explain everything over the phone, but I might need Leo to stay with you for a few days while I sort some things out." There was a long pause. "What kind of complicated situation? The kind where it might be safer for him not to be with me right now? Daniel, you're scaring me. Are you in some kind of legal trouble?" "Not exactly, but Sarah, please. If I ask you to come get Leo, can you do it without asking a lot of questions?" "Of course, but Daniel, if you're in danger, maybe you should call the police." "The police might be part of the problem." After he hung up, Daniel found Leo sitting on his bed, carefully tying a bundle of Victorian-era love letters with the same faded ribbon that had originally bound them. The letters were part of what they'd taken from the train car, evidence of Victoria and James's relationship that Sarah had confirmed were authentic based on Victoria's known handwriting. "Dad, are the bad guys going to try to take our treasure?" Daniel sat down beside his son, marveling at how children could cut through complicated adult situations to reach the heart of what mattered. "I don't know, Leo, but whatever happens, I want you to remember that we found something important. Not just the valuable things, but the story of people who loved each other and tried to do the right thing." Leo nodded solemnly. "Like Victoria and James." Exactly like Victoria and James. Outside, the dark sedan was still parked across the street, and Daniel could see the glow of someone using a cell phone inside. Their discovery had set events in motion that he was only beginning to understand. And tomorrow's lunch with Robert Ashworth would determine whether they were about to become very wealthy or very sorry they'd ever followed his father's map into the hidden valley. The love letters in Leo's hands represented more than historical evidence. They were proof that sometimes the most valuable treasures were the ones that couldn't be measured in dollars, and the most important discoveries were the ones that revealed truths people had tried to hide. The Petroleum Club occupied the top 3 floors of one of Billings' tallest buildings, its windows offering commanding views of the Yellowstone Valley and the rim rocks beyond. Daniel had never been inside a place like this. All leather chairs and oil paintings and the kind of quiet wealth that spoke in whispers rather than shouts. Robert Ashworth was waiting at a corner table, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from never having to worry about money. He stood when Daniel approached, extending a hand and offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Quinn, thank you for joining me. I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of ordering us both the salmon. It's excellent here." Daniel accepted the handshake and took the offered seat, acutely aware of how his second-hand khakis and discount store shirt looked in this environment. "Mr. Ashworth, I appreciate the invitation, but I'm not sure what we have to discuss. Please call me Robert, and I think we have quite a bit to discuss." Robert signaled the waiter for drinks. "You've been researching my family's history, and I understand you may have come across some items that once belonged to my great-aunt Victoria." Daniel had prepared for this moment, but sitting across from Robert Ashworth in person felt different than he'd expected. The man radiated the kind of power that came from controlling resources and influencing decisions. But there was something else in his demeanor, a carefully controlled desperation that suggested he was more worried about this conversation than he was letting on. "I've been interested in local railway history," Daniel said carefully. "Of course, a fascinating subject. The early railway development in Montana is often overlooked in favor of mining and ranching history." Robert paused as their drinks arrived. Scotch. For him, water for Daniel. "But I suspect your interest goes beyond academic curiosity. What makes you think that?" Robert reached into his jacket and withdrew a railroad pocket watch, its gold surface gleaming despite its obvious age. The watch was still ticking, its steady rhythm audible in the quiet restaurant. Daniel recognized it immediately. It was identical to one they'd seen in the train car's treasure vault. "This belonged to my great-grandfather, Thomas Ashworth. It was made by the same Swiss craftsman who created timepieces for several wealthy families in the early 1900s. Distinctive." Work very recognizable to someone who knows what to look for. Robert set the watch on the table between them. Imagine my surprise when I learned that someone had been asking questions about similar timepieces at a local antique shop. Daniel felt his stomach drop. They hadn't taken anything to an antique, a shop, but Leo had been carrying his drawings everywhere, and children had a way of showing their artwork to anyone who expressed interest. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Mr. Quinn. I'm stating facts. You and your son have discovered something that belongs to my family, and I'm here to discuss how we might resolve this situation to everyone's benefit. The salmon arrived, beautifully prepared, and probably worth more than Daniel usually spent on groceries in a week. He pushed it around his plate while Robert ate with the calm efficiency of someone conducting routine business. Let me be direct, Robert continued. Victoria Ashworth was a troubled young woman who stole valuable family property before disappearing in 1903. Whatever you've found represents stolen goods that rightfully belong to her legal heirs, namely my family. That's interesting, Daniel said, because the historian I've been working with believes Victoria was trying to expose environmental crimes your family committed. For the first time, Robert's composure slipped slightly. Ah, yes, Ms. Chen, a respected academic, though prone to romantic theories about historical events. I'm afraid she's allowed her research to be colored by modern environmental sensibilities that simply didn't exist in 1903. So you're saying Victoria wasn't murdered? I'm saying Victoria was an unstable young woman who ran away with a lover and was never heard from again. Any evidence suggesting otherwise is either fabricated or misinterpreted. Robert leaned forward, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Mr. Quinn, I've done some research on you as well. Wrongfully terminated from your job, going through a difficult divorce, facing eviction, you're clearly a man who cares deeply about providing for his son. I respect that. Daniel felt the conversation shifting into territory he'd been dreading. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 for the return of any items you may have found that belonged to Victoria Ashworth. No questions asked, no legal complications. A simple transaction that solves your immediate financial problems and allows my family to reclaim property that was taken from us over a century ago. $50,000. More money than Daniel had ever had at one time. Enough to get them back on their feet and give Leo the stability he deserved. But it was also an amount that confirmed the treasure they'd found was worth far more than Robert was offering. And if I decline your generous offer, Robert's smile returned, but now it carried an edge of steel. Then you'll find yourself facing legal challenges that will consume whatever resources you have and more. Trespassing charges for accessing private property, theft charges for removing items that don't belong to you, perhaps even child endangerment charges for involving your son in illegal activities. The land where we made the discovery is national forest. Are you certain about that? Property boundaries in remote mountain areas can be surprisingly complex. My family has maintained legal claims on various parcels for generations, and I have very good lawyers who specialize in such matters. Daniel looked out the window at the sprawling city below, thinking about Leo waiting at Sarah Chen's house, probably drawing more pictures of their adventure and asking when they could go back to see the treasure again. I need time to think about your offer, of course, but Mr. Quinn, I should mention that my offer has a limited time frame. If word of this discovery becomes public, if media attention gets involved, if federal agencies begin investigating, well, and then the situation becomes much more complicated for everyone involved. Robert stood and placed a business card beside Daniel's untouched salmon. You have until Friday to decide. That's 3 days to choose between a generous private settlement and a very public legal battle that you cannot afford to fight and cannot win. As Daniel walked to the elevator, he could feel Robert's eyes watching him. The older man's words echoed in his mind, a very public legal battle that you cannot afford to fight and cannot win. But there was something about the way Robert had delivered the threat that suggested he was just as eager to avoid public attention as he was claiming Daniel should be. Outside the building, Daniel called Marcus from a payphone. "They made an offer," he said when his lawyer friend answered. "How much?" "50,000. Marcus whistled low. "That's either very generous or a fraction of what they think it's really worth." Robert Ashworth also made it clear what would happen. "If I don't take it, legal threats, the works, trespassing, theft, child endangerment. He says he has lawyers who can make property boundary disputes work in his favor. Daniel, listen to me carefully. If they're offering $50,000 to make this go away quietly, then what you've found is worth significantly more. But they're also right that they can make your life very difficult if you fight them. So what do you recommend?" "I recommend you get that treasure authenticated and documented by independent experts before you make any decisions. If it's as historically significant as Sarah Chen believes, there might be federal agencies who would be very interested in protecting it." That evening, Daniel sat in Sarah's living room, while Leo and her daughter Emma played board games at the kitchen table. Sarah had been following the news coverage of similar discoveries, and her laptop screen showed articles about treasure finds that had resulted in lengthy legal battles. "The problem," Sarah explained, "is that without independent verification of the historical significance, this becomes a simple property dispute between you and the Ashworth family. But if we can prove that what you found contains evidence of environmental crimes or other illegal activities, then it becomes a matter of public interest. And that would protect us from Robert's legal threats? It might, but it would also guarantee that this story becomes national news, with all the complications that brings." Daniel watched Leo laughing with Emma as they played their game momentarily, forgetting the adult complexities that surrounded their discovery. In 3 days, he would have to choose between financial security and the possibility of exposing a century-old injustice. The pocket watch that Robert had shown him was still ticking in Daniel's mind, marking time toward a decision that would determine not just their financial future, but whether Victoria Ashworth would finally receive the justice she'd been denied for over 100 years. 2 nights before Robert Ashworth's deadline, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. He would return to the Hidden Valley one more time, alone, to carefully document everything they'd found before making any choice about Robert's offer. If he was going to sign away their discovery, he wanted to understand exactly what he was giving up. Sarah had reluctantly agreed to keep Leo overnight again, understanding Daniel's need to see the treasure vault one final time without putting his son at risk. She'd also provided him with a high-resolution camera and GPS equipment to create a complete record of their discovery. The night hike to the valley felt different than their first adventure. Where before Daniel had been filled with wonder and possibility, now he carried the weight of adult complications and the knowledge that powerful people were watching his every move. The forest seemed darker, the familiar trail more treacherous, as if the mountains themselves sensed the approaching confrontation. The train cars sat exactly as they'd left them, ivy-covered and peaceful in the moonlight. Daniel set up battery-powered work lights and began the careful process of photographing and cataloging everything in the hidden vault. Each item told a story: jewelry that had been worn to elegant parties, paintings that had hung in a mansion's drawing room, documents that recorded the daily business of a wealthy family. It was while photographing a stack of letters tied with blue ribbon that Daniel noticed something odd about the vault itself. The wooden flooring that had concealed the treasure showed signs of recent modification, scratches in the wood that looked too fresh to be from 1903, and metal hinges that, while aged, appeared to have been installed with modern screws. Examining the vault more closely with his flashlight, Daniel discovered what Leo's sharp eyes had missed during their first exploration. The vault had a false bottom. The discovery mechanism was ingenious, a section of the vault's floor that lifted out completely when the right pressure was applied to hidden springs in the corners. Beneath it lay a deeper chamber, this one lined with oiled leather and containing items that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. Documents, dozens of them, carefully preserved in waterproof cases. And as Daniel read by flashlight, the true story of Victoria Ashworth began to emerge. These weren't love letters or personal mementos. These were business records, government correspondence, and most damning of all, internal company documents that detailed Thomas Ashworth's systematic dumping of mining waste into water sources throughout western Montana. The paperwork showed a pattern of environmental destruction that had poisoned rivers, contaminated farmland, and caused health problems in mining communities, all covered up through bribes to government officials and intimidation of potential witnesses. But the most shocking document was Victoria's own handwritten testimony, dated just days before her disappearance. I have tried to reason with my father, but he refuses to acknowledge the damage his operations are causing to innocent families. The children in the mining camps are falling sick, their drinking water contaminated by chemicals from our processing operations. When I threatened to take this evidence to federal authorities, he told me I would be committed to an asylum before I could speak to anyone outside the family. I fear for my life, but I will not be silenced. I've moved the evidence of our crimes to a place where it will be safe, along with resources that will allow me to start over far from my father's influence. If something happens to me, I pray that someday someone will find this cache and ensure that justice is finally served for the people we have wronged. The enclosed will establish a trust for the benefit of families affected by Ashworth mining operations, to be administered by whoever discovers this evidence. I name James Morrison as my heir and executor, but if he cannot serve, then I designate that these resources should go to anyone brave enough to expose the truth about what my family has done. Daniel's hands shook as he read Victoria's final document, a will that not only exposed her family's crimes, but legally designated the treasure for whoever found it, specifically for the purpose of seeking justice for environmental damage caused by Ashworth operations. But there was more. Beneath Victoria's testimony lay modern documents that made Daniel's blood run cold. Photocopied reports from the 1970s and 80s showing that Ashworth Industries had continued the same practices well into the modern era, contaminating groundwater near several Montana communities and covering it up through the same methods Thomas Ashworth had pioneered decades earlier. Someone had been maintaining this hidden archive, adding evidence as recently as 5 years ago. The modern documents were signed with initials J.M., and included a note that made everything clear. I am James Morrison, Jr., son of the railway engineer who disappeared with Victoria Ashworth in 1903. My father survived what the Ashworth family intended to be a murder and spent his remaining years documenting their continued crimes. This cache has been maintained by our family for 4 generations, waiting for someone with the courage to bring these crimes to light. The Ashworth family believes they buried their secrets with Victoria, but the truth has been preserved. Use it wisely. The signature was dated just 3 years ago. Daniel sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just about treasure or even historical justice. It was about ongoing environmental crimes that had affected thousands of people over more than a century. The Ashworth family's power and influence had allowed them to poison communities and cover up their responsibility for decades of environmental damage. His phone buzzed with a text message, despite the remote location. The message was from an unknown number. You've been in that valley too long, Mr. Quinn. Time to come out. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Someone was watching him, even here in the hidden valley that he'd thought was completely secret. He quickly packed the most important documents into his backpack, leaving the treasure, but taking the evidence that could finally bring justice to the Ashworth family's victims. As he prepared to leave, another text arrived. "Bring the boy, both of you, now." Panic flooded through Daniel as he realized what was happening. Whoever was watching him knew about Leo, knew where he was staying, and was making it clear that his son was in danger. He ran through the forest toward the trailhead, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots in his haste to reach his truck and get to Sarah's house. The night that had started as a quiet mission to document their discovery had become a race to protect Leo from people who would apparently stop at nothing to keep their family's crimes hidden. The drive back to Billings took forever. Every mile filled with scenarios of what might be happening to Leo while Daniel was too far away to protect him. He called Sarah's house repeatedly, getting only voicemail, then tried her cell phone with the same result. When he finally reached Sarah's neighborhood, he could see police cars parked outside her house, their red and blue lights painting the quiet residential street in emergency colors. Daniel's worst fears seemed to be coming true until he saw Sarah and both children standing safely on the front porch, talking to what appeared to be friendly officers rather than being threatened. Sarah ran to meet him as he got out of his truck. "Daniel, thank God you're here. Someone broke into my house tonight, but we weren't home. We'd gone to Emma's school play. When we came back, the police were already here. A neighbor had called about suspicious activity. Is Leo okay?" "He's fine, scared but fine. Daniel, whoever broke in was looking for something specific. They didn't take any electronics or jewelry, but they went through all my research materials and destroyed my files on Victoria Ashworth." Daniel felt the weight of the documents in his backpack, evidence that someone was desperate enough to commit burglary to suppress. The false bottom of Victoria's vault had contained more than historical artifacts. It had contained proof of crimes that were still affecting people today. "Sarah, we need to get Leo somewhere safe, and then we need to contact federal authorities. What we found isn't just about the past, it's about crimes that are still happening." As they gathered Leo and prepared to leave for a location where Robert Ashworth's influence couldn't reach them, Daniel realized that their simple treasure hunt had uncovered something far more valuable than gold or artwork. They'd found evidence that could finally bring justice to communities that had been poisoned by corporate greed for over a century. But first, they had to survive long enough to tell the story. Federal agent Patricia Hawkins had investigated environmental crimes for 15 years, but she'd never seen a case quite like this. When Daniel Quinn contacted the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division at 3 in the morning, claiming to have evidence of ongoing environmental crimes dating back over a century, her first instinct had been skepticism. Treasure hunters and conspiracy theorists contacted federal agencies regularly with wild claims and dubious evidence, but the documents Daniel provided were different. The letterhead was authentic, the historical details checked out, and the modern additions to the archive showed a pattern of environmental damage that matched several unsolved cases her division had been investigating for years. Now, 36 hours later, she sat in a secure conference room in the federal building in Billings, surrounded by evidence that could result in criminal charges against one of Montana's most powerful families. "Mr. Quinn," Agent Hawkins said, "I want to make sure you understand what you're getting into. The evidence you've provided suggests that Ashworth Industries has been covering up environmental crimes for decades. If we move forward with this investigation, you and your son will be in the center of a very high-profile federal case." Daniel looked around the conference room at the assembled team, FBI agents specializing in white-collar crime, EPA investigators, a federal prosecutor, and Marcus, who had driven up from Billings to provide legal counsel. Leo sat beside him, carefully coloring in a federal agent's coloring book while listening to every word, with the sharp attention children brought to adult conversations that affected their lives. "Agent Hawkins, 3 days ago, someone threatened my son to keep me quiet about what we found. Last night, someone broke into the house where he was staying, looking for evidence. I don't think we have a choice about being in the center of this anymore. Sarah Chen, who had been authenticated as an expert witness for the historical aspects of the case, spread out photocopies of Victoria Ashworth's final testimony on the conference table. The pattern is consistent across more than a century. The Ashworth family has used their wealth and political connections to suppress evidence of environmental damage, intimidate witnesses, and avoid accountability for crimes that have affected thousands of people. "What's our legal exposure?" Marcus asked. "My client found these documents on what he believed to be public land, and he immediately contacted federal authorities when he understood their significance. Federal prosecutor James Mitchell, a stern man in his 50s who looked like he'd spent his career taking on powerful defendants, reviewed Daniel's statement one more time. The property boundaries are complex, but our research indicates that the hidden valley where the discovery was made is indeed within the boundaries of the Custer-Gallatin National Forest. Any claims by the Ashworth family about trespassing would be difficult to sustain." "What about the treasure itself?" Daniel asked. "The gold, jewelry and artwork that we left in the vault." "That's more complicated," Agent Hawkins admitted. "But Victoria Ashworth's will, assuming it can be authenticated, appears to designate those resources for anyone who discovers evidence of her family's crimes. You may have a legitimate legal claim, especially since you immediately reported the discovery to authorities." Leo looked up from his coloring book. "Are the bad guys going to go to jail?" The question, delivered with the directness that only children could manage, cut through the legal complexities to the heart of what they were trying to accomplish. "We're going to do everything we can to make sure that happens," Agent Hawkins told him. "But Leo, it's going to take time, and it might be scary sometimes. Are you brave enough to help us?" Leo nodded solemnly. Victoria was brave. If she could be brave back then, I can be brave now. The plan that emerged from 6 hours of planning was both simple and complex. Simple in concept, they would simultaneously execute search warrants on Ashworth Industries offices, Robert Ashworth's home, and the Ashworth Foundation headquarters while making the evidence public through a coordinated media announcement. Complex in execution, requiring coordination between multiple federal agencies and careful timing to prevent evidence from being destroyed. "The key," Prosecutor Mitchell explained, "is that we move fast enough that Robert Ashworth can't use his political connections to suppress the investigation, but carefully enough that we don't compromise the evidence that will be needed for prosecution." Daniel's role would be to return to the Hidden Valley with a federal team to officially document and recover the treasure vault's contents, ensuring that Victoria's cash was preserved as evidence. Sarah would work with historical experts to authenticate the documents and establish their significance. Leo's drawings, which had initially seemed like innocent childhood artwork, would serve as important documentation of the discovery's context. "Mr. Quinn," Agent Hawkins said as the meeting wrapped up, "I want you to understand that once we begin this process, there's no going back. Robert Ashworth will use every resource at his disposal to discredit you and challenge the evidence. You'll be under intense scrutiny, and your personal life will become public knowledge." "Agent Hawkins, 3 months ago I lost my job for refusing to falsify environmental reports. My ex-wife left me because I couldn't provide the kind of life she wanted for our son. We've been living paycheck to paycheck, facing eviction, watching Leo's dreams get smaller every day because I couldn't afford to make them come true." Daniel looked at Leo, who had finished his coloring and was now carefully organizing the crayons by color. "But Leo and I found something that can make a difference. For people who've been hurt the same way we've been hurt. If Victoria Ashworth was brave enough to risk her life to expose these crimes, then I think we can be brave enough to finish what she started." That evening, in a secure hotel room provided by the Federal Marshal Service, Daniel helped Leo pack. A small suitcase with his favorite clothes and books. Tomorrow, Leo would stay with Sarah and Emma at a safe house while Daniel returned to the valley with the federal investigation team. "Dad, are we going to be rich when this is over?" Daniel sat on the bed beside his son, thinking about Victoria's will and the treasure vault and the complex legal proceedings that would determine their financial future. "Leo, I honestly don't know. The lawyers say we might be entitled to some of the treasure, but it could take years to sort out all the legal details." "I hope Victoria gets to rest now," Leo said quietly. "In my book, Brian has to work really hard to survive in the wilderness, but at the end, he knows he's stronger because of what he went through." "What made you think of that?" "Because Victoria had to hide in the wilderness too, kind of. And she was waiting all this time for someone to find her story and make it right." Leo looked up at his father with serious eyes. "Do you think she knows we found her?" Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think she does, buddy. I think she's been waiting a long time for someone like us to come along." The next morning brought news that changed everything about their situation. Agent Hawkins called Daniel's hotel room at dawn with an update that made it clear just how high the stakes had become. "Robert Ashworth has been in contact with several high-ranking politicians, claiming that you're part of an elaborate fraud designed to extort money from his family. He's also hired a team of private investigators to look into your background, and he's petitioned a federal judge to block the search warrants. Can he do that? He can try. But we have independent verification of the document's authenticity, and the historical evidence supports your discovery. More importantly, we've connected some of the modern documents from the cache to active cases we've been building against Ashworth Industries for current environmental violations." "So what happens now?" "Now we move fast. The search warrants are being executed this morning, and we're holding a press conference this afternoon. By tonight, this story will be national news, which means Robert Ashworth won't be able to make you disappear quietly." Daniel looked out the hotel window at the mountains, where their adventure had begun, just days earlier. Somewhere up there, Victoria Ashworth's train cars were waiting to give up their secrets to federal investigators. Somewhere in those hidden chambers lay evidence that would finally bring justice to communities that had been poisoned by corporate greed for over a century. But more than that, somewhere in those mountains lay proof that sometimes ordinary people could make extraordinary discoveries that changed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others who had been waiting for someone brave enough to speak the truth. "Agent Hawkins," Daniel said, "we're ready." The press conference was held in the federal building's largest conference room, packed with reporters from newspapers and television stations across the region. Daniel had never faced a crowd like this. Cameras and microphones pointed at him. Like weapons, reporters scribbling notes and checking their phones, the buzz of conversation creating an energy that felt both exciting and terrifying. Agent Hawkins stood at the podium with the calm confidence of someone who had delivered news that changed people's lives many times before. Behind her, a table displayed some of the artifacts from Victoria's cache: the gold locket, some of the letters, and photocopies of the most damning documents. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. This morning, federal agents executed search warrants at multiple locations connected to Ashworth Industries as part of an investigation into environmental crimes that span more than a century. The investigation was initiated based on evidence discovered by private citizens in a remote location in Montana." She gestured toward Daniel, who sat at a side table with Leo, Sarah, and Marcus. "Mr. Daniel Quinn and his 8-year-old son Leo made a discovery while hiking that has provided us with documentation of systematic environmental crimes, including illegal dumping of mining waste, contamination of water supplies, and cover-up. Activities that continued into the present day." A reporter raised her hand. "Agent Hawkins, can you confirm reports that this involves a treasure worth millions of dollars?" The discovery includes valuable artifacts, but more importantly, it includes documentation of crimes that have affected the health and welfare of communities throughout Montana. The monetary value of the artifacts is secondary to their significance. As evidence, another reporter called out, "What is the Ashworth family's response to these allegations?" Robert Ashworth's legal team has issued a statement denying all allegations and characterizing this investigation as harassment based on fabricated evidence. However, the documents we've recovered have been authenticated by multiple independent experts, and they corroborate evidence we've been developing through other investigative channels. Daniel felt his palms sweating as Agent Hawkins continued. "I'd like to invite Mr. Quinn to describe his discovery and explain why he chose to bring this evidence to federal authorities." Walking to the podium felt like the longest journey of Daniel's life. The cameras tracked his movement, and he could hear the click and whir of photographers capturing every step. When he reached the microphone, he looked out at the sea of faces and felt momentarily overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. Then he saw Leo, sitting calmly at the table with his notebook open, making sketches of the press conference, with the same careful attention he'd brought to drawing their adventure in the hidden valley. The sight of his son, completely unintimidated by the crowd and focused on documenting this moment in his own way, gave Daniel the strength he needed. "My name is Daniel Quinn, and 6 days ago, my son Leo and I were facing eviction from our apartment. I'd lost my job for refusing to falsify environmental reports, and we were down to our last $100. I decided to take Leo on a hiking trip, following a trail my father had told me about, because I wanted us to have one good memory together before our world fell apart." The room was completely quiet now. Every reporter focused on his words. "We found an abandoned train in a hidden valley, and inside we discovered treasures that belonged to Victoria Ashworth, who disappeared in 1903. But we also found something more valuable than gold or jewelry. We found her testimony about environmental crimes her family was committing, and evidence that those crimes continued for decades." Daniel paused, looking directly into the cameras. Victoria Ashworth was brave enough to risk her life to document these crimes and preserve evidence for someone who might someday be able to seek justice for the people who were hurt. "Leo and I were just the ones who happened to find what she left behind," a reporter shouted. "Mr. Quinn, what do you say to claims that you're attempting to extort money from the Ashworth family?" "I say that we immediately contacted federal authorities when we understood the significance of what we'd found. If we wanted money, we had an offer of $50,000 to keep quiet about the discovery. Instead, we chose to make sure this evidence reached the people who could use it to help communities that have been poisoned by corporate greed." Leo stood up from his chair and walked over to his father. Without being asked, he took the microphone and spoke with the clear voice of a child who had something important to say. "Victoria was really brave," Leo said. "She hid the truth for a really long time, waiting for someone to find it. My dad taught me that when you find something that doesn't belong to you, you should try to give it back to the right person. Victoria wanted this to go to people who would tell the truth about what happened. So that's what we're doing." The room erupted with questions and camera flashes, but Daniel could see that Leo's simple explanation had cut through all the legal complexities and political maneuvering to reach the heart of what they were trying to accomplish. They weren't treasure hunters or extortionists. They were just a father and son who had found evidence of injustice and chosen to do the right thing, even when powerful people tried to stop them. The aftermath of the press conference moved with the speed of a digital wildfire. Within hours, Leo's simple statement about doing the right thing had been shared across social media platforms, turning an 8-year-old's innocent wisdom into a rallying cry for environmental justice. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and by evening, Daniel and Leo found themselves at the center of a national conversation about corporate accountability and the power of ordinary citizens to expose wrongdoing. But it was the phone call that came at midnight that confirmed they had truly won their battle against the Ashworth family's century-long cover-up. "Mr. Quinn, this is James Morrison III, the voice said when Daniel answered his hotel room phone. "I believe my grandfather left some documents in the cache you discovered." Daniel sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Morrison, you're related to the railway engineer who disappeared with Victoria?" "I am, and I've been waiting 20 years for someone to find that evidence and have the courage to make it public. My family has been maintaining that cache for 4 generations, adding documentation whenever we uncovered new evidence of Ashworth Industries crimes. Where are you?" "Driving to Billings from Seattle. I'll be there by morning, and I have additional documentation that will support the federal investigation. More importantly, I have a story to tell about what really happened to Victoria Ashworth and my great-grandfather in 1903. The next morning brought James Morrison III to their hotel, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that suggested he worked with his hands rather than in an office. He carried a briefcase that contained photographs, letters, and documents that filled in the missing pieces of Victoria and James Morrison's story. "They weren't killed," he told Daniel, Sarah, and Agent Hawkins as they sat around the hotel room table. "But Thomas Ashworth tried to have them killed. Victoria and my great-grandfather discovered the plan and staged their own disappearance, making it look like they died while trying to escape." He opened a photograph album that showed images spanning several decades. "They lived quietly in Oregon under assumed names, and my great-grandfather continued documenting Ashworth Industries' crimes through contacts he maintained in the railway and mining industries. Every few years, he would return to Montana to add new evidence to the cache, hoping that someday someone would find it and use it to seek justice." Sarah studied the photographs with growing excitement. "This proves that Victoria survived, at least for several years after her disappearance. These pictures show her in her 30s and 40s. She lived to be 73, James Morrison III confirmed. She never married my great-grandfather. They remained devoted friends who shared the mission of documenting the Ashworth family's crimes. When she died in 1950, her final wish was that the evidence be preserved until someone brave enough and foolish enough came along to challenge one of Montana's most powerful families. Agent Hawkins reviewed the additional documentation with the focus of someone who understood its legal implications. This establishes a clear chain of custody for the evidence and confirms that Victoria Ashworth intended for it to be used exactly as Mr. Quinn has chosen to use it. The hotel room phone rang, and Daniel answered to find Robert Ashworth on the other end. But this time, the voice was very different. Tired, defeated, and stripped of the confident authority that had characterized their lunch meeting. "Mr. Quinn, I'd like to discuss a settlement. I thought you said we were thieves and extortionists. I was wrong. The federal investigation has uncovered evidence that we have made mistakes over the years. Serious mistakes that hurt people. I'd like to make amends." Daniel looked around the hotel room at the people who had become his allies in this fight. Sarah with her passion for historical truth, Agent Hawkins with her commitment to justice, James Morrison III with his family's century-long dedication to preserving evidence, and Leo, who had started all of this by simply noticing that some floorboards didn't quite match. "Mr. Ashworth, I think it's too late for private settlements. This isn't about money anymore. It's about making sure that communities affected by your family's actions receive the help they need." The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Robert Ashworth said something that Daniel hadn't expected. "You're right, Mr. Quinn. And for what it's worth, I think Victoria would be proud of what you and your son have accomplished. When Daniel hung up, Leo looked up from the drawing he was making, a picture of Victoria Ashworth standing beside the hidden train, smiling as she watched a father and son discover her long-kept secret. "Dad, I drew Victoria happy because her story finally got told." Agent Hawkins smiled as she reviewed the final documents that would complete the federal case against Ashworth Industries. "Leo, I think you're exactly right. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that give people justice they've been waiting for longer than anyone should have to wait." Outside their hotel window, the Montana mountains stretched toward a horizon that suddenly seemed full of possibilities instead of limitations. Daniel Quinn, who had started this journey as a desperate father with $97 and an eviction notice, now sat at the center of a story that would ensure environmental justice for communities that had been waiting over a century for someone to care enough to seek the truth. But most importantly, he sat beside a son who had learned that sometimes the greatest treasures weren't gold or jewels, but the courage to do what was right, even when powerful people tried to stop you. 6 months later, Daniel stood in the kitchen of their new home, watching through the window as Leo played in the backyard with their golden retriever, Scout. The house was modest but comfortable: 3 bedrooms, a garage for Leo's newly repaired bicycle, and enough space for a father and son to build a life together without worrying about eviction notices or empty refrigerators. The legal resolution had taken months to sort out, but Victoria Ashworth's will had held up in court, designating the treasure for whoever discovered evidence of her family's crimes. After legal fees and the establishment of an environmental remediation fund for affected communities, Daniel and Leo had received enough money to secure their future without making them wealthy beyond their needs. More importantly, the federal investigation had resulted in criminal charges against 3 current Ashworth Industries executives and civil penalties that would fund cleanup efforts in communities affected by decades of environmental damage. Robert Ashworth himself had avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating with investigators and agreeing to testimony that filled in gaps in the historical record. "Dad, come see what Scout can do," Leo called from the backyard. Daniel stepped outside to watch his son demonstrate the dog's latest trick, balancing a treat on his nose before flipping it up to catch it in his mouth. Leo's laughter filled the air, the sound of a child who had learned that sometimes adventures led to happy endings after all. "That's pretty impressive, buddy. How did you teach him that?" Sarah showed me. She's really good with dogs because she had to train her research dogs when she was studying archaeology in college. Sarah Chen had become a regular part of their lives over the past months, her relationship with Daniel developing slowly and naturally as they worked together to establish the Victoria Ashworth Historical Foundation. Her expertise had been crucial in authenticating the historical evidence, and her passion for justice had matched their own commitment to seeing the case through to its conclusion. The foundation now operated out of a small office in downtown Billings, using part of the treasure to fund research into historical environmental crimes and support communities seeking justice for corporate wrongdoing. Sarah served as its director, while Daniel had established an environmental consulting practice that specialized in helping small communities navigate complex environmental issues. "Dad, look," Leo said, pointing toward the driveway where Sarah's car was pulling in. "She's here for dinner." Sarah had brought Emma with her, and the 2 children immediately ran off to inspect Scout's latest achievements while the adults prepared dinner together in the kitchen. It felt natural and comfortable, like they were building something that could last. "Any word on the Montana Central Railway Preservation Project?" Sarah asked as she helped set the table. "The Park Service approved the proposal," Daniel said. "They're going to stabilize the train cars and create a historical site in the Hidden Valley. Visitors will be able to hike in and see where Victoria preserved her evidence, and there will be educational materials about environmental crime and the importance of whistleblowing. Leo will love that. He keeps asking when we can take Emma to see the treasure trains. Speaking of Leo, I got a call from his school today. His teacher wants to nominate his project about Victoria Ashworth for the State History Fair. Leo had spent months working on a presentation about their discovery, interviewing Sarah about historical research methods, talking to Agent Hawkins about environmental crime investigation, and creating detailed drawings that documented their entire adventure. His project had become a sophisticated exploration of how ordinary people could make extraordinary discoveries that changed history. What did you tell them? I told them to ask Leo. It's his story to tell. At dinner, Leo shared his excitement about the history fair and his plans to include Scout in his presentation. Apparently, the dog's treat-catching abilities were somehow relevant to explaining historical research methodology. Victoria would be proud, Sarah said as they cleared the dishes. Her story is finally being told, and the communities her family hurt are getting the help they deserve. I still think about her sometimes, Leo said. Do you think she knew that we would find her treasure? Daniel considered the question seriously. I think Victoria hoped that someday someone who cared about doing the right thing would find what she left behind. I don't know if she knew it would be us specifically, but I think she believed in the kind of people who would choose justice over money. Like us, Leo said matter-of-factly, like us. Later that evening, after Sarah and Emma had gone home and Leo had gone to bed, Daniel sat on the front porch with Scout at his feet, looking up at the Montana sky and thinking about the journey that had brought them here. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Ashworth Industries settlement approved by federal judge. $50 million for environmental remediation. Your discovery made this possible. Daniel smiled, remembering their first desperate hike into the mountains with $97 and an eviction notice. Leo's sharp eyes and curious mind had started everything, but it had been their combined courage to do the right thing that had turned a simple treasure hunt into a victory for environmental justice. In his pocket, he carried a new compass. Not an antique mystery like his father's, but a modern instrument that he'd bought for Leo's upcoming birthday. This one pointed reliably toward magnetic north, but Daniel had learned that the most important discoveries came when you were brave enough to follow a different kind of direction entirely. Scout lifted his head as Leo appeared in the doorway, apparently unable to sleep. Dad, can we go hiking this weekend? I want to show Sarah and Emma the place where we first saw the train tracks. Sure, buddy, but this time we'll stick to the marked trails. Leo grinned. Unless we find something interesting off the trail, right? Daniel laughed, realizing that their adventure had taught Leo something valuable about staying curious and being brave enough to explore when something seemed worth investigating. Unless we find something interesting, he agreed. Above them, the Montana stars shone with the same light that had guided Victoria Ashworth and James Morrison through their own journey toward justice over a century earlier. Some stories, Daniel reflected, took generations to reach their proper endings, but they were worth the wait when they finally brought truth to light and healing to those who had suffered in darkness. Their treasure hunt was complete, but their real adventure, building a life based on courage, curiosity, and commitment to doing what was right, was just beginning.